because we've got a world-revered, big brain guy. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce, Woude Muller will be interviewing our guest. So let me introduce him with no further ado. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing one of the biggest brains in the history of Cape Town. Not only is that brain revered in Cape Town, but he's revered around the world. He knows everything about sports, injuries, whether it's back pain, chest injury, doping. He's the guy. Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest brain in sport, the greatest mind in sport. Ladies and gentlemen, Ross Tucker.
I think that was quite an introduction, Ross.
Yeah, I'm dubious about this thing, very, and I'm also I tell you what's definitely not true is that billing you gave me at the beginning about if World Rugby are stuck and they need help, they phone me. That's definitely not the case.
Come on, don't be modest.
No. Like, I'm lucky to be involved, but we'll talk about the process by which these laws get created, and you'll see it's not some science guy sitting in his office deciding what happens. That's for sure.
Before you do tell us how it changes and how you evaluate it and everything, just maybe tell us what you do at World Rugby, because I've known you for years and I still don't know.
Yeah, like, it changes weekly and sometimes daily what I do. Whatever comes up is what I do. Did you ever see that movie Michael Clayton with George Clooney? He was a lawyer, and he's kind of like a fixer. So no matter what you needed, you called George Clooney. So sometimes I feel like I'm the scientific equivalent of him in that movie. So my background is as a physiologist. I have a PhD in sports science and physiology, and I actually studied cycling and running and performance in marathons and that sort of stuff. And then in 2015, I was, I guess, headhunted by the chief medical officer from World Rugby, an Australian guy called Martin Raftery, who said, would I like to come and work with him on some of the injury prevention stuff that they're trying to do? And I said, absolutely, because I wanted to get out of the university here in Cape Town. And so I started then, and basically my job involves anything where a decision is made based on scientific data. I try and provide the data to the decision makers. So when they change laws, when they institute policy, we've just done literally today a transgender guideline, for instance, for World Rugby. That's a scientific issue. The head injury stuff that you were talking about 20 minutes ago is a scientific issue. Concussion management and prevention, substitute, whatever. So there's a whole bunch of different areas that I'm involved in. And so the short answer is I help provide the research that informs the decision.
Well, then tell us about the process. How do you choose which rules you're going to change? How do you evaluate them? What happens before we see this is the rule that just changed?
So the first thing is problem recognition. So you've got to start by saying, well, is there a problem here? Because otherwise you're just imagining issues that you're going to fix. So let's say, for instance, head injuries. In 2011, at the World Cup in New Zealand, there was no temporary substitution. So a player would go down after a knock, and many listeners wouldn't even appreciate this, but the player would go down, and the doctor would run on the field. And on average, that doctor would have about 64 seconds to assess that player in a crowd of sometimes 50,000 or more people and decide whether or not that player had a concussion. So not surprisingly, it was then discovered that more than half the time, the player who's concussed on the field stays on the field. So, and that's obviously not good, because now you've got a concussed player who could take a second knock, and that could be potentially fatal. So that's the problem. So then they think, well, okay, now you know what the problem is. What's the solution? The solution is you have to lower the barrier to get that guy off the field, because the doctors are reluctant to take a guy off when he might not be concussed. Yeah. And so the end result of that was they gave this initially 5-minute substitution, and then it became a 10-minute substitution, and that's how the HIA was born. The problem, though, was that because players were now more easily being identified as concussed, because before it was being hidden or missed, suddenly concussion went from being one of 10 injuries in rugby to by far the most common injury, and it still is. It's about threefold more likely to occur than any other injury. And then many listeners will have watched movies like that Will Smith concussion movie, and they understand that there's all these fears about what happens to players when they get older. So concussion is a big deal for the sport. And so the question then is, all right, so that's the problem. The solution is, all right, do we know when these things happen? Do we know who's at risk? Do we know how the concussion happens? And those are all scientific questions. So then what happens is we form committees and we get coaches, we get referees, we get players, and we get me. And I manage the scientific process of trying to understand when does a concussion happen? Who's more likely to be concussed? Then once you've identified those things, then you can try and solve those problems. So, and you said this 20 minutes ago, if you know that the tackler, the guy initiating the contact, is 3 times more likely to have a concussion than the ball carrier, then what do you do to protect the guy from himself? You see, because that approach is different compared to if you are trying to protect the guy on the receiving end. So then again, we pulled together committees. And so in that instance, we got Eddie Jones, we got Gus Pichot was on that committee, Alain Roland from the refs, Paul O'Connell, the Irish and British Irish lock. So we get these people together in a room and we say, all right, we the scientists have created a picture. We can't solve that, but you can. So what do you think we should do? And that's basically how the high tackle sanction framework was born, although it took a couple of years to get to where it is now.
Well, yeah, so talking about this high tackle sanction framework, Dame, if you want to bring it up for us, Ross, maybe you can run us through it, how you actually got to this final one. This is the one that you used just before the World Cup, and how you basically looked at when to give a penalty, when to give a yellow, when to give a red card to dangerous players. Maybe you can run us through this, because you were part of creating this whole thing and this whole framework.
Yeah, so this was many years in the making, many people's inputs to develop this thing. So that meeting I just mentioned, where we had Eddie Jones, Paul O'Connell, we had Sophie Spence from England, was the women's player was there, Pichot, John Jeffries, there was a whole bunch of people. That meeting was held in Dublin in late 2016. By 2017, the outcome of that meeting is that we've got to be harsh on higher contact tackles, because what we'd found is that when two players are making when a player is making a tackle, if he's in an upright position and their two heads are sharing airspace, that's when the danger is at its highest. So what you ideally want is a tackler here to be bent against a ball carrier who's upright, because then only one head is at risk and his head is safer. Now, a lot of people freak out because they're like, oh, what if my head hits the hip of the ball carrier? Well, of course, that risk is there, but this risk is much higher than this one. So because we were able to quantify, we were able to say, would you rather have this or this? And the answer was very clear. You'd rather have this bent player than an upright player. So the high tackle initially it came out as a zero tolerance directive. But what happened then is that we made a new problem for ourselves, because we communicated that we wanted to clamp down on high tackles, and the referees tried to do it. And so all of a sudden you saw an increase in red cards. There was an increase in yellow cards. Yeah. Players were being sent off. And it created all this new controversy because people didn't agree with the decision. So we were, in a sense, victims of our own desire to stamp out the behavior. And we created confusion as a consequence of inconsistency. And then what happened was, and I distinctly remember this, I was in France at the time attending various meetings, and the now infamous Owen Farrell tackle on Andre Esterhuizen happened in that test match in Twickenham. And most listeners will remember that Gardner didn't even give a penalty when everyone felt it should have been a yellow card. And I remember talking with some colleagues and so on at the time, and we said, well, how is Angus Gardner meant to assess that if nobody has ever defined a shoulder charge? Now, listeners are thinking, well, that's stupid. Like, we know what a shoulder charge is. I guarantee you that you don't know it well enough that I could show you 10 clips and you wouldn't agree 100% of the time with someone else over when there was a shoulder charge and when there wasn't. And we knew this because in medicine, it's the same thing. I could show you a clip of a player being knocked unconscious by a tackle. And this has been done, by the way. If you show that same clip to 10 doctors and you say, did that guy lose consciousness? Half of them say yes, half of them say no. So the principle was that if we didn't help the officials understand what they were looking at, then how could we expect consistency in their decision? So the high tackle sanction framework was an attempt to create consistency by giving them definitions and a process to simplify it. And that's where it came from. And so then it got all kinds of input from referees, coaches, players. and ended up looking like the document that you've shared a couple times here tonight.
But how do you get the refs and the players to buy into this? Because it's easy to see it on paper and be like, oh, that makes complete sense. But from a player's perspective and from coaches and refs, it's not that easy to just kind of buy into this. And I think a lot of them don't necessarily want to buy into that.
Yeah,
or
so
has it become easier through the years?
The easy part is that everyone understands that player welfare matters. So no player, no referee is going to say we don't need this, because they are the players are the ones who are getting the brain injuries, and they're nervous about what these brain injuries mean, because just like you or me, they can watch Will Smith telling us Hollywood's version of what CTE and whatever else looks like. So nobody disagrees on the need, but there is a lot of sensitivity around how you go about doing it, and it's been quite challenging. And so the high tackle sanction framework, I mean, it caused a lot of controversy in the World Cup last year, because Reece Hodge tackled the Fijian number 6 in their first match, and that was not given red when it really should have been. That was widely acknowledged afterwards. He got a ban. So there were all these inconsistencies, because from the perspective of the referees, they're human too, and they don't want to send players off, especially in the first 15, 20 minutes. But you guys have just spoken about that trial from New Zealand and Australia about a 20-minute red card. That's a solution to that particular problem, because it's been put forward that if you allow the referee to send a player off with a red card, and then 20 minutes later a substitute comes on, they'll give more red cards because it's less impactful. So people are like, oh, but then it's not severe enough. But it actually might. So it's a smaller stick, but it might be used more often, and that might be more beneficial. So that's an example of how you try and win the referees over. For the players, it's tricky, because they don't want to be punished harshly for what they deem to be accidents. And this is where the cultural change that rugby is struggling with comes in. So when I go in to tackle someone and I get it wrong by 10 centimeters, and I'm aiming for here, but I hit here and he ducks there, now I'm going straight into his head. That's going to be a red card. So the culture change, or the attitude changes. We don't want you to aim here. We're saying aim for just above the belly button. That's where you've got to aim, because then you give yourself a margin for error. So there's a little bit of tension there in terms of like what is required from welfare and what is wanted by the players. But we kind of just have to constantly have dialogue, and a number of players are fully behind it. It's just a question of giving them consistency. So we're constantly working on materials that'll go up soon. Actually worked on some of that today, examples of how it should be applied and what it should look like and so on. And then again, it's the same thing as the breakdown. So in the end, it just requires what I would call courageous leadership, because, last weekend I watched these 2 games in New Zealand. It did not take 50 minutes before the commentators started whining about penalties. So there's this constant pressure from the outside on those referees. You're spoiling the game. You're giving too many penalties. Leadership needs to say, actually, we're going to hold this line, and you must adapt and change, and then we'll get the sport to a better place. So really, just the bottom line is, do you need the change? In the case of concussions, you needed the change. Because brain injury could kill rugby in the same way that it's drastically hurting American football among juniors in that country. The same thing for the breakdown. Did the breakdown need to change? Yes or no? If the answer was yes, then you've got to let the medicine work. You can't reduce the dose after 1 week. It's stupid.
Yeah. So you put up a tweet last week with the rugby about the breakdown laws and something that World Rugby posted about it. Obviously, you agree 100% with the breakdown law, or they're not the law, the implementation of it. How is it going to change the game in the future if this is going to be how it's going to be implemented in every single match going forward, Super Rugby test matches?
Yeah, so the breakdown has been like an elephant in the room for a long time. I mean, since I started there in 2015, but it's an extremely complex aspect of the game. So, and this is one of the reasons rugby is fascinating, by the way, because when listeners think about it, you'll say, oh, just do this. But the problem is when you change something here on the top left, then something else changes here in the bottom right, because everything in the sport is interconnected. So, for example, what had happened in the breakdown over the last decade, maybe 15 years, is that as they changed the laws, remember that the jackler, the guy coming in to steal the ball from the defending team, or the tackler had to show clear release and then on the ball, as long as he was on his feet. Then they changed that he had to actually like come in from his own gate, and there was a delay that he had to allow and so on. And what it ended up causing was that it was much, much more difficult to steal the ball, in a breakdown. The consequence was that coaches said, all right, well then in that case, we're not going to put players in the ruck. And all of a sudden you had 13 or 14 men standing in the defensive line, and there were no spaces in the back line for the team to then run into. Because, and one of the top coaches in the world said this to me, is that if I can't pressure you at the ruck, then I'm going to pressure you on the pass. And so now you get rush defense, line speed, no spacing, and the game looks like rugby league. So the whole premise of the breakdown laws was to try and make the contest more viable for both teams, to try and pull players into it, and also to protect the jackler so that he doesn't have to survive the clean. So, and listeners can go and look this up. World Rugby's produced what I think is actually a really good resource, and it's got video examples. It's got a very clear breakdown of the breakdown, if you'll allow me that one, where they've explained exactly what the tackler is going to be doing, the ball carrier. And so this committee gets put together. And again, I'm on it mostly to ask questions like, how do we know if it worked? What might the unintended consequences be? But it had Ian Foster, Joe Schmidt, Richie Gray, all of whom have coached World Cup international winning sides. Jaco Pape and Wayne Barnes were there from the referees. It had 3 or 4 players. Victor Vito was among them, Josh Beaumont. And they're basically saying, okay, what's the referee looking for? What's the player trying to do, and so on. So I watched the game in New Zealand, and I'm seeing 28 penalties, but I'm happy with that because it's exactly what I expected would happen. And what I expect should happen this week is there'll be 20 to 23 penalties a match, because 1/4 of them the players will have learned and they'll change. And the week after there'll be 15, then 12, then 10, and we'll be back to normal. And that's a successful thing. But the sad thing will be if the referees give in to the commentary and the media pressure and so on, and they start actually letting a little bit go here, a little bit go there, and all of a sudden we're back where we started.
So if there's 2 laws that you think that still need to change in rugby to make it a better product, because let's be honest, it lost a little bit of its flair as rugby. What would you say would be 2 things that you think should still change?
Yeah. So I sit on like World Rugby's law review groups, and so these aren't even my answers. These are the 2 laws that come up every single time this law review group meets, and they are never agreed upon, because that LRG is made up of 10 different countries, plus a few other independent, like the International Players Association and independent members. And they have a vote to decide on whether to accept law suggestions or not. And it's pretty much always split down the middle. And those 2 laws are, number 1 is to either ban or allow the maul to be collapsed. That was an experimental thing a few years ago. You remember that? And that keeps coming up again and again. It's like, because they're saying that the maul is basically obstruction and it shouldn't be allowed. So it would take the sport away from that static contest. And the other one is that scrum infringement should not be penalized with penalties, but with free kicks. And I know you guys were discussing this a little bit before I came on. There's some amazing data actually from around the world where different scrum reset numbers have been looked at. And in the Northern Hemisphere, something like 60% of all scrums will collapse and need to be reset. And in the Southern Hemisphere, it's only about 10 to 20%. So there's a very clear difference between the way that scrums are played in the North versus the South. And what it suggests is that the scrum is seen, and these are not my words, this is what's been reported at those meetings. The scrum is viewed as a potential to win a penalty. That's what it is in some places. That's all they use the scrum for. One very well-known South African, let's say World Cup winner, whose name I won't reveal, went to play in Europe, and at the first meeting he said, can we please see what moves we run off a scrum? And they say, we have no scrum moves. We win penalties. So there's a paradigm or a mindset around the scrum where they just want to win penalties. And so the suggestion there is that you should only, if there's a scrum infringement, it should be a free kick, not a penalty, to try and disincentivize that. And then I'll give you a third one, is that I think box kicks should be markable from anywhere on the field to try and discourage the box kick, because I think that's actually been something in the last 2 years that I think there's too much of. So I would make it possible to mark a box kick from anywhere on the field.
And then the 50-22 rule that I was talking about earlier, do you think that is a good rule to change? How will it change the game? Will it make it faster? Will it not? Why are they saying that this rule should change?
Because they're concerned about the line speed and the rush defense. And so I spoke a little bit earlier about with the breakdown, the way that it's gone, the defending team doesn't even put guys in there. Basically, it's just a tackle on the floor. And they have 14 players or potentially 13 players in the line. And once you're numbered up like that, all you do is you rush up. And so the 50-22 was designed to give you reason not to rush, because if the opposition could now kick in behind you and win the line out, then you would have to drop a wing back on either side to cover that space to try and prevent that kick from gaining ground. So what that would mean that is instead of having 13 players in the line on their feet, you'd only have 12, and then you'd be less inclined to rush up. So that's the theory, which is very attractive. I mean, I think it's quite an exciting concept and it makes sense. The problem is that it seems to happen too infrequently to have a major impact on the game. So in the places where it's been trialed so far, which is in Australia last season in their version of the Curry Cup, Fiji, Georgia, it only happens once every 5 or 6 matches. And that's not enough to change the behavior. So that's why in this New Zealand competition and in the Australia one, they've now said that they're going to see clear space or players must be clearly onside. It's the same thing. They want to disincentivize the rush, because that rush defense is causing injury, because high speed equals injury risk, and it's also suffocating the game. So they want to try and slow down the speed of the line in defense. That's the key point they're trying to get to there.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of positives for rugby, I think, and I think it's moving in the right direction. I just hope it's going to keep going that way.
I'm biased, obviously, because I'm involved in all these things, and I'd like to think the process we follow is good. I mean, I don't know what football changes one law every 10 years. We change 10 per year, it feels like sometimes. And I get that might look confusing to people, but the game is so much more complex. And I do believe that they get Ian Foster and Joe Schmidt and Richie Gray, and they get Eddie Jones. And so this is not, I've heard the accusation that rugby is a bunch of guys in suits drinking cocktails and deciding on the fate of the game. But these between the lines things are not that. They are legitimate, sincere attempts to make the game better. And I think they do it in quite a good way. But again, I'm biased. So.
Yeah, I see Mbolelo is there to ask a question for you. So I think he might have some more questions and interesting questions to ask you. So thank you for answering mine.
No worries.
Yeah, good stuff there. Hey, Ross, I didn't do you any favors. What I should have said was Professor Ross Tucker. How do you feel about that whole thing? Because I know how professors get about that.
Oh, I really don't care. Like, you can call me Mr. It's fine by me. Like, I spent enough time in that weird academic world where everything's your title and your letters to be fed up with it eventually. That's why I left it.
Hey, the title doesn't do the job. And you accused me of kind of lying to the listeners and saying they don't call you every time. You literally just told us that they do. So I was right, Ross. And I would like an email with the official World Rugby to say I apologize for being too humble, because hey, that was hugely fascinating, Ross. And I think I guess my thing, just to carry that on into other sports, is rugby for me is still, relatively speaking, an amateur game. So naturally it'll have to change faster, because it's changing at an exponential rate. I mean, the athletes are getting better and better and better, and we're still refining the game. So I'm with you there. What I'd like to know, and something that interests me hugely, we of course are in South Africa, right? And this is a problem around the world. At schoolboy level, and then in sport in general, and we'll transition to a case that we're dealing with currently on the highest level. Is what do you think we can do to prevent the scourge of steroids and let's call them performance enhancing drugs at the school level? Is there anything that scientifically can be done to discourage it? Is rugby too professional at the school level?
Yes, we need a whole 2 episodes for this one. Like, it's a massive, massive question. Just on that, the reason it's not so much humility, but there is an issue sometimes around when you're involved in this stuff. And I remember one of the players, I won't say who it was, when we introduced the high tackle sanction framework and some talk about injury, the first thing they come back would say, "Oh, did he play?" As if the only people who should ever have an opinion are the ones who played international rugby and won a World Cup. But this player didn't win a World Cup either. But anyway, so that's the reason for that.
All right. Hey, let him know, Ross. Let him know. Let him know.
Thanks to us, by the way. Thanks to us, he didn't win a World Cup.
Let him know.
The steroid issue is a massive one, especially, again, South Africa is a little bit of a victim of shining a spotlight on its own, dirty closet, inside its own dirty closet, because we test our schoolboys more than any other country, and so we've discovered that we have this issue. And there are scientists and medical folk in this country who surveyed schoolboys, and we know that this is a major, major issue in our schoolboys. I find it very difficult to believe that if you doped as a schoolboy in order to get into a Craven Week team and then an academy and then a professional setup, that you would stop doping as a professional unless the threat or the risk of being caught was enormous. And the sad reality in international sport is that threat is not that big, because it's very difficult for anti-doping authorities to test everyone enough for them to be scared of it, So I'm pretty sure I live on the side of skepticism and cynicism sometimes. I'm pretty sure that rugby does have an issue, as does every other sport. And the solution to that is that, again, you have to address it at the cultural level. You have to address it at the legal, legislative level. And ultimately, it's a market-driven thing. So until the sponsors and the media decide that doping is going to be stigmatized to the extent that it's actually forced out, it's not going to happen. So, for instance, in cycling in the early 2000s, doping became such a problem for them that some media, German news, for instance, said they're not going to cover the Tour de France as a sporting event because it's not believable. It's actually a work of fiction. And all of a sudden, sponsors started pulling out, and then, only then, did people actually start taking anti-doping a little bit more seriously. And I think the same thing is going to be true. You have to tilt the incentive, because at the moment there's too many incentives to dope and not enough disincentives not to dope. And until that changes in the other direction, you're not going to get rid of it, because the money's too high, the rewards are too high. And if you don't dope and you don't get that Craven Week slot, that academy contract, that Stormers contract, then what are you going to go and do?
Yeah, hey, talking about that, hey, great points. Great. Ross, you got a big brain. Like the stuff you say. Oh, man, those are fantastic points. Talk to me about Lance Armstrong playing the victim. Like, is that the most insufferable thing in the world, or do you think Lance was just under such institutional pressure we should feel something for him? Because I'm over him. I got to tell you right now, Lance Armstrong, you need to be quiet. But I'd love to hear from you.
So, back in the mid-90s, Lance is a victim. Because at some point he would have sat in a hotel room in Europe and realized that he's either got to go back to Texas and become a painter, or I don't know what he would have done, a school sports coach, or he's got to dope, because that's the choice every single professional cyclist was basically faced with. Now, some of them made the moral upstanding choice and they left the sport, which is good. They were in a distinct minority. Lance chose to dope. So in that sense, he's a guilty victim. Is there such a thing as a guilty victim? The problem then is that Lance's story evolves and it gets so big that he becomes such a big brand that in the end he becomes the perpetrator of the crime, and he becomes this don, this almost mafia-like godfather figure of doping. And he's bullying people, he's abusing people, he's cheating, he's backstabbing, he's telling on his own rivals to the authorities, he's bribing people potentially. So at that point, he makes the transition from being a victim to actually a pretty gross perpetrator. I watched this documentary that came out recently. Did you watch that, the ESPN one?
I did see it.
There are elements in there, where Lance talks about his attitude now and so on, and he's not remorseful at all. He seems, about the doping bit, he seemed genuinely remorseful about some of the people that he'd trodden on in the course of his doping and his cover-ups, which I guess is at least some progress. But he just comes across as a guy who, given another opportunity, would do it all again, because he lives life as a predator, and he's not the top of the food chain, then he's climbing his way to the top. So it is difficult to feel sympathy for a guy like that. If he came out and genuinely apologized to everyone, and if he told people about who else was involved in that doping, and he was 100% clean in the way that Tyler Hamilton has been, and I think Floyd Landis has been, then I would accept Lance Armstrong back into sports society. But he doesn't want to tell people where the bodies are buried, but he wants to be aggressive towards people who, I mean, when he called Floyd Landis a piece of shit, like, why would you, because he told on him? That kind of betrays
It's
the
wild.
guy's weird, yeah, it's a weird
It's
psyche.
wild. He's wild. He's like, everybody forgave Barry Bonds and Mark Maguire, and they're like, we know they were taking every steroid available on planet Earth. But like you said, they humbled themselves like, oh yeah, that was maybe not the right thing to do. Don't know if you saw the Sammy Sosa documentary on the weekend that came out. For fascinating stuff on the same thing. But listen, I didn't just want to talk to you about that. Ross, my game's back, the Premier League. We saw 2 tragic injuries yesterday. Granit Xhaka, brutal. Do you think we came back too soon post-COVID? You know, were these guys ready? Should the Premier League have given them another 2-week window for preseason to prevent this kind of thing? Or is this just the cost of doing business?
It's both, eh? Like, so I think they came back too soon, but someone's made a decision that trade-off was worth it because of the money. Because if they delayed it any longer, maybe they would have finished, I don't know, 60 matches out of the 80. Was it 82 they had left?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then maybe they would have had to. So I think someone made a trade-off and they said, can we take this risk? And they said, look, the risk is worth taking. But there's no doubt that the risk of injury is considerably higher when you have too little time to prepare. Back in 2011, the NFL had a lockout because of a player's strike, and they had to take what was normally a couple months of preseason and do it in about 3 weeks. And they had 12 Achilles tendon ruptures in about 2 weeks when they came back into camp, compared to normally having 5 in a whole year. So this does happen, and it's known. I was chatting yesterday with someone from Singapore's Olympic Federation, saying that they've had swimmers come back and they've got all sorts of shoulder injuries from coming back too quickly. Data from the Bundesliga suggests the same thing. So the problem is that the players they've just been deconditioned, and then you cannot condition quickly enough in 4 weeks to then play the match load. And if that's happening in one game, can you imagine after 5, 6, 7 matches within 3 weeks, what that injury picture is going to look like? It's going to, and that's why, like, I watched you on, was it Monday that you went through the fixtures? By the team's 6th match from now, their squad might be 50% sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it's not gonna make Arsenal any worse. It's not like, hey, let's be very clear. Let's draw a clear line. Arsenal are that bad already. David Luiz does not need to be injured to be awful. Ross, before I let you go, I want to address one more thing. And Ross, I appreciate you. Your time's precious. I know that. And everybody wants a piece of you. So I really appreciate you for coming on tonight. Christian Coleman has come out. For those who don't know, he's kind of got the title as the next great hope out of America, because they haven't had a great one since probably Maurice Green in blue, white, and gold. I mean, truly like bolt great, right? And he recently, I mean, it's his excuse for cheating, guys, go and check the tweets out. It is unbelievable. And I'm not saying he doped, but the notion that he can miss a test, Ross, is how slack are we that an athlete can even think that's okay? Because you remember Rio Ferdinand got his, 9 months, way back when, for missing a test. And Christian Coleman, could you maybe take me through the whole situation of what is wrong with that behavior, and where do you see that going for athletics?
Well, it's not one test, right? Because the system has been designed that you have 3 opportunities to miss a test, and then you get the ban. So if I'll try and be quick on this, the root cause is that doping works when you train, not when you compete. So people watch the Olympic Games and they wonder, is that guy doping? 99 out of 100 times, the guy's not doping at the Olympics. He doped 3 months before the Olympics, because that's where he got the benefit, while he was at his house in Phoenix, Arizona, or somewhere in, I don't know, let's say Potchefstroom, if it's a South African athlete. So what the authorities have done is they said, right, we're going to show up when you're training at your home in order to test you, because that's when you're going to be doping. But now, obviously, we can't track people 24/7. So what athletes are required to do by international sports and authorities is to tell anti-doping authorities where they will be for 1 hour every single day. So most athletes will say, I am at 27 Smith Street from 6 a.m. to 7 a.m. every single day, and then I get a knock on the door, they have to pee into a cup, and that's their doping test. If they're not there in that 1 hour window, that's called a missed test, and it goes down as a strike. 3 strikes is a ban. So what happens with Coleman is he's now got his 3rd strike, which was last year in December. And his story is that he told the authorities that he would be at his house one afternoon, and then he went Christmas shopping at the local shopping mall. And the testers obviously arrived while he was out, and they knocked on the door and there was no answer. And he's unhappy that they didn't phone him. He says they should have called him, because if they'd called him, he would have come back to do the doping test. The problem is that when the athlete says they're going to be at their address, the tester is under no obligation to phone. Like, you've said you're going to be there, so then you must be there. I'm not here to nanny you and chase you around the shopping center while you try and buy your kids' birthday presents or Christmas presents, as in this case. So he's looking at a 2-year ban as a consequence. And what makes it even more outrageous is that last year in August, just before the World Championships, it was leaked that he was about to get a 2-year ban because he'd missed three tests in that period. And for various technical reasons not worth going into, one of those missed tests was actually scrapped because it actually occurred in the previous window, because you're allowed 3 per year. And so this is actually his 4th missed test over the course of just over a year. And he's crying foul because he thinks that they should have called him up when he wasn't where he said he would be. And then he comes up with all the usual stuff, because I'm a clean athlete, I'm willing to be tested anytime, any place. Well, Christian, anytime, any place is exactly the point of the 1-hour window. It means that you're going to be anytime, in that place for us to test you. And if you're never there, then don't lie to us about being willing to be tested anytime, any place. So he can't be the next Usain Bolt, because he's got 2 massive question marks over him already, aside from the fact he'll never run as fast anyway. But the US will have to find another guy to take that place, I suspect.
Fair enough. I wonder what he got for Christmas. I hope it was a great present, because he's about to have no money real soon.
He made a joke actually in his post, saying that his family had gotten him a camera on the doorbell so that in future he can see when the anti-doping guy is there. If you are the 5th highest, if you're in the top 5 highest paid track and field athletes in the world, and you are the champion at the biggest profile event, the 100 meters in the world, you don't leave this element of your life to hoping that someone sees the anti-doping guy in a doorbell at your door. It's ridiculous. It's just such a stupid position. It's disrespectful to the whole sport, actually, even if he's innocent.
It's ridiculous, because it's almost, you know what the theory is for me there? It's like, you know, if you cheat on your girlfriend, you're like, oh, no, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry that I did it. I'm sorry you caught me. What are we doing here? Like who is this guy? Hey, Ross, love your work. We've got a couple of questions for you from the society, and then we'll let you go. All right, Dave, hit us with the first one. Giraffe Creative says, Ross, what are the player feelings towards rule changes? Do they buy in at this stage? Purely from the players' side, what's the pushback been like from their player representatives?
It's mixed. Most are happy with the principle and the concept, because they understand that the intention is their own safety. So if a law change is made to prevent the number of head injuries and concussions, players are saying this is great, thank you very much. Where they are resistant is that they feel sometimes that they're not always involved in the dialogue and discussion, and I fully accept that. And one of the things we learned from the high tackle framework is that we have to involve more of the players more often through the international players agencies and associations to bring them along the journey with us so that they understand it. Because a lot of the conflict and tension is misunderstanding, not necessarily objection. And then they do have some concerns around the harshness of those sanctions, and that's where we're trying to juggle. So in our case, our red card is going to be a 20-minute sin bin and then a replacement. Is that going to offset your concerns? Okay, now you're happy. And it's a constant negotiation a little bit sometimes. So for the most part, they're happy. Where there's unhappiness, it's the result of confusion. And I suspect with the breakdown law applications that have come in now, there's going to be unhappiness as a consequence of confusion as well, which is why the messaging has to be so tough and stringent. But when a player gets sent off for a tackle that he thinks was accidental, he's obviously extremely unhappy. You saw that in the media all the time in the World Cup. But we have to change the culture of the sport. So sometimes, the players just have to accept that what was fine 2 years ago or 6 months ago is not going to be okay anymore. So change.
Yeah, like, hey, we want you to be 40 years old and have a memory. Like, hey, how about that?
Exactly.
That's what we want. All right, next question
Exactly.
from
So
Sherry Lee
it helps,
Thompson.
for instance.
Yeah.
Sorry, it helps, for instance,
go ahead,
when you
Ross.
see when Pat Lambie's retiring in his 20s because of persistent concussion symptoms. When you get other players who are retiring, there was a Scottish player who retired because of a neck injury, a neck shoulder problem in a tackle. Like, the players understand they're doing an exceptionally high risk thing, and so they are supportive of the principle of lowering that risk. And what we need to do better within World Rugby is bring them on that journey and consult a lot more with them, which is a mistake we've made in the past, and we'll keep making, because what are you going to do? Survey 4,000 professional rugby players around the world? You can't. So some people are always going to feel marginalized, but we have to get that better moving forward.
Yeah, we have to, because Sam Cane is basically Robocop now with his neck. But anyway, let's move on from that. Sherry Lee Thompson says, who's the most interesting athlete from a sports science perspective right now? Is that such a question for you scientists? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, because I am. My background was in endurance, athletics, and so on. Eliud Kipchoge is fascinating to me because he's considerably the best marathon runner we've ever seen in history. The sub 2 hour thing is less impressive to me because of the shoes that they used. That's a topic for another day, perhaps.
Yeah, we'll come back for that.
Yeah, he's quite old now, and he's not getting slower. I mean, again, that might be in part the shoes, but I would. As a group, the Kenyan long distance runners are extremely fascinating. I find them remarkable. In the team sports, the elite rugby player who plays in the loose forwards is a fascinating specimen because they cover the most distance, they make the most tackles, and they are involved at the most rucks. And so that combination of endurance, speed, and upper body power and strength is quite remarkable. They must be right up there. And then Katie Ledecky, the swimmer, would be really interesting. In a previous generation, Phelps would have been the same. Whenever you have these never seen before athletes who win more medals than anyone in history, that's obviously going to be extremely fascinating. The best athletes in the world, in my opinion, are in basketball. If I think of guys like LeBron James, Zion Williamson, these guys are remarkable athletes. It would be unbelievable to see them play a sport like rugby if they could get the culture right there. But there you go. Yeah.
There you have it, huh? Wow. Good stuff. Dave, we got anything else for the prof before he goes? Yeah, we got Treshka van Aswachen says, why not let everybody dope and see who's the best? Lance is or was not the only person who dopes. All right, this is the age-old argument. What do you say, Mr. Big Brain, Ross Tucker? Oh, Professor, sorry.
Wish we could move away from this big brain thing. First of all, like if I've got a headache and you've got a headache and we both take 2 aspirin, my headache stays around and you basically fall asleep. I mean, let's say that happens, right? And the point I'm trying to make is that you and I respond completely differently to medication. It's the same thing with athletes. They respond so differently. So 2 athletes who both take EPO, testosterone, and growth hormone, one of them will go from here to there, and the other one will go only on a very slight upward trajectory. So if doping was legal, you wouldn't be seeing who the best athlete was. You'd be seeing who the best responder to pharmaceuticals was. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that in the absence of any regulation at all, there's no ceiling for what you can do. So the only ceiling is set by your conscience and how risk averse you are. And if a person is willing to take more risks, they'll be a better athlete. And that's not really what you want for sport when you consider a 16, 17-year-old who's now on the cusp of getting a deal to play professional rugby, cycling, running, tennis, whatever it is, it's football. You don't want that guy to have a choice where if he doesn't dope, he can't get in. And if he doesn't dope a lot, he can't win. Because in the absence of any regulation, the only people who win will be the high responders who dope a lot. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So even though anti-doping doesn't currently work 100%, it does help a little bit to curtail the scale of the problem and the size of the doping. And what that means is that even though the guys who win the Tour de France and many of these events are probably dopers to some extent, their doping is this instead of this. And there's only 10% of them doping instead of the 40, 50, 100% who would be doping otherwise. So I think you have to keep it in there and you have to rather figure out how to do it better. The analogy is that if you're traveling on the highway or driving around on the roads and there's no speed limit at all, there will be a lot of reckless drivers and there will be a lot of car accidents. So even though some people break the speed limit, doesn't mean that the speed limit is irrelevant. Because if you don't have something in place, then the most reckless people will do the most reckless things, and then it becomes harmful for everyone who wants to drive on those roads with them.
Got you. You can't argue that. Basically, Professor Ross Tucker is saying people are savages. I got you. I translated it for you, but I couldn't agree more with that. But I'd love to hear what more people think. One more. You might enjoy this one. Do rugby players follow Tim Noakes' panting diet or something similar? What's your thoughts on diet for rugby players?
I reckon if you surveyed 300 of the World Cup players last year at the World Cup, I mean, how many teams were there? 24. Yeah, it's actually more. 650. You would be hard pressed to find one who's on a low carb diet, because low carbohydrate diets might work very well for some people, but the moment you're an elite athlete and you're on the field 10 to 12 hours a week and you're in the gym for potentially another 4 to 5 hours a week, and so much of your life is spent doing high intensity, quality type exercise training, if you don't have carbohydrates in your diet in some way, then your body just cannot sustain that level of activity day to day. So the energy demand has to be met from somewhere, and that somewhere is carbohydrates. What is probably happening more often is that they periodize their diet. So when they're in a block of training that isn't necessarily that intense, their carbohydrate might drop quite low, but then on match days and for higher intensity trainings, they'll take it. So for instance, I was at the hotel when New Zealand was staying in 2015, just before that World Cup final. Their pre-World Cup final night dinner was loaded with potatoes and pastas and carbohydrates and everything you can imagine with carbs in it. But they're also well known because like a couple months before that, they'd go through periods with less carbohydrates. But you can't do it on a banting diet. You can do it on a sensible, balanced, low carb, high carb switch diet, but not banting.
Hey, Ross, you got Richie McCaw and Kieran Reid. You could eat grass and you who cares what you eat? Pitch up, give us the trophy. We're going to go home. Jacinda Ardeen's our president. Professor Ross Tucker, I want to thank you for all of your time. You're an awesome man. I hope to have you back. Before I let you go, please tell the people, because I know there are people that would have found this so fascinating, because for me, I'm a sports nerd. Every time I get to talk to you, it is wild. Where can they listen to your podcast? So give them all your contact details, because I know there'll be people going, oh my goodness, I didn't even know you had a podcast perhaps. Where can I listen to it?
Yeah, so my podcast is just over a year old now. It's called The Real Science of Sport, because the science of sport was taken, so we didn't know what to do. So we just said, we're the real one. So we're The Real Science of Sport on iTunes, Acast, Spotify, and pretty much wherever you get your Overcast, for instance, wherever you get your podcasts. So you can find those. And then I'm on Twitter at Science of Sport. And then Instagram is Ross Tucker 10. So people can find me in any one of those three places, and trying to do what I can to translate sports science for people like you've given me the chance to tonight. So thanks for that.
No, absolutely. And so I know you said you don't like it, and you might be looking at my big head thinking big brain. You're wrong. Small brain in here. Professor Ross Tucker, you are the absolute best. I cannot wait to have you on again. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, guys.